Hello friends, my name is JJ. So America, as I am sure you know, is a land of diversity. It was colonized by multiple different empires, settled by peoples from all over the world, and continues to be shaped by big waves of foreign trade and immigration that flow into it to this day. By the way, as I usually do, I am using America to describe the continental civilization that includes both the US and Canada. Now, it is cliche to get sentimental about America's cultural diversity, but it really is quite remarkable. In fact, the more videos I make about American culture, the more I am convinced that, if anything, the role of immigration and foreign cultures in shaping American culture is probably underrated. So today, I thought we would do a little exercise in which I will run through a list of countries and give you my pick for what I think their biggest impact on American culture has been. Because I think it is pretty true that almost every country on Earth has made at least one substantial influence on American culture that is pretty high profile and visible. Now, before we get started, I am just going to put a couple of big qualifiers on this exercise. The first is that a country's biggest cultural influence on America cannot just be people from that country. Different countries have sent different numbers of people to this continent over the years, making it easy to argue that, say, the main relevance of Italy to America is the fact that there are almost 30 million people in the US and Canada with Italian ancestry. But counting that kind of thing is too easy. The second rule is that food does not count, because that is also too easy. You can make a very persuasive case that cuisine is the most visible cultural presence of just about every foreign country in America, just because Americans are extremely open-minded when it comes to eating the food of other cultures, and that running an ethnic restaurant has been one of the most common immigrant jobs on this continent for literally centuries. So if I counted food, I think the list would be pretty boring, since I think that there are probably only a very small handful of countries where we could say that their food is not their biggest cultural impact on America. All right, so let's get started with... So the biggest part of Argentine culture that has entered the cultural mainstream of America is probably the tango, which is of course a very famous style of dance and music that originally comes from Buenos Aires. I personally love tango music with the accordions and all of that. You may notice that I use it in my videos a lot. I think it is really effective at capturing all sorts of different moods, from romantic to frantic to depressive, which is probably why it's become such a popular form of evocative background music in American movies and TV shows and even video games. The dance, too, is probably like in the big top 5 most popular styles of dance in America, at least in the sense of like formal types of dancing that you would learn at dance school. People are not tangoing at the club, although I'm sure you could probably make the case that there are tango influences in the sort of formal American couples dancing that you do at weddings and that sort of thing. Australia is interesting just because it is such a heavily stereotyped country that you could say the standard bundle of Australian stereotypes in general have made the biggest cultural impact on America, just given how often they're employed in pop culture whenever a reference to a fun foreign country is required. But if I had to nail it down to just one stereotype in particular, I would probably say the animals. Kangaroos, platypuses, and koala bears are easily some of the most recognizable and even beloved animals in American culture today, despite the fact that they don't live here and most Americans will go their entire life without ever seeing one. It's kind of wild when you think about it, how two of the most beloved American cartoon characters of all time, the Tasmanian Devil and Perry the Platypus, are based on non-American animals. Austria is a relatively small country that has really punched above its weight, culturally speaking. The music of the Austrian composer Mozart is obviously very well known and popular in modern America, as are the theories of the great Austrian psychotherapist Sigmund Freud. But I think it's possible that Austria might have made a bigger impact on American culture through so-called Austrian economics. This is a broad term that is often used to describe what we now think of as libertarian economic theory, as put forward by two very influential Austrian economists, F.A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. They are often held up as the intellectual godfathers of the American libertarian movement and have tons of dedicated fans in conservative circles to this day. Their theories basically posited that government control over the economy inevitably leads to tyranny, and that therefore there is a correlation between free markets and human freedom in general, which has obviously been part of mainstream Republican conventional wisdom for most of the post-war era. It's interesting that while describing yourself as being really into Austrian economics remains a right-wing signifier in America, I don't think that this style of thinking has remained all that influential in Austria itself. Like Argentina, I would say that Brazil's biggest impact on American culture is musical. In this case, bossa nova music. Originating on the beaches of post-war Rio, bossa nova is that kind of smooth jazz music featuring a lot of maracas and drums and trumpets that we tend to associate with tropical or relaxing vibes. Unfortunately for the Brazilians in modern America, I think that this style of jazz is now most associated with obnoxious situations in which someone is trying to keep you calm and pacified, like a doctor's waiting room or when you're on hold with tech support. Egypt is better known around the world for its ancient past rather than its modern culture. And in an American context, I think that the main legacy of this is the ongoing American love affair with mummies. As I discussed in my award-winning video on the American monster canon, the discovery of the beautifully preserved tomb of King Tut in 1922 inspired a lot of mummy mania in America, and this in turn would eventually prompt the Universal Studios people to make several different movies about ancient Egyptian mummy monsters. And now the mummy, as an abstract thing, is just a standard Halloween goblin alongside witches and pumpkins. Thanks, Egypt. France has historically made a very huge contribution to American culture just by virtue of being one of the major colonizing powers of this continent. Obviously, here in Canada, that legacy is felt most acutely in the form of language politics, wherein tensions between the relative political power of French-speaking Canadians and English-speaking Canadians continues to be a major fault line in national affairs. But outside of Ottawa, I think it can be pretty striking to observe just how much of the French language has been incorporated into standard American English as well. All sorts of random French expressions are part of mainstream conversation, including bon appetit, déjà vu, faux pas, c'est la vie, coup d'etat, en garde, and even RSVP, which means répondez s'il vous plaît, right? In a Canadian context, I'm often pretty critical of the political role played by the French language, but then somebody points out how inseparable French has always been to the culture of this continent, and I have to respond, touché. Now, before we go any further, I hope you will indulge me as we take a moment to hear a word from today's video sponsor, Surfshark. Hello, friends. So we've been having a lot of fun today talking about all of the different countries of the world and all of the wonderful things that they have to offer. But of course, countries have some bad things to offer as well. Bad things such as blocks on internet content. No matter where you are in this big world of ours, your internet experience will always be a little bit different depending on where you live. Maybe your internet is more censored, limiting your access to discussions of certain topics or your ability to access, shall we say, certain websites. Or maybe you find yourself chronically unable to watch certain shows and movies due to restrictive licensing agreements in your country. Or maybe your government is fighting an ill-considered multi-front war with big tech, resulting in social media feeds that are a mishmash of restricted posts and rigged algorithms. Who can say? The point is, no matter where you live, you need a VPN app. VPNs put you in control of your internet experience, allowing you to pretend to come from whatever country you want and get access to whatever you want. Plus, they give you all sorts of additional layers of security to help protect your online connection, which is very important in these dodgy times of ours. And nobody offers a better VPN app than Surfshark. It gives you the most features for the best price, which can be as low as $189 a month or $249 a month Canadian. I did a price comparison using the app. Plus, they are having a special holiday promotion right now where you can get up to 6 months free when you sign up for a long-term contract. Like I've said many times in the past, a VPN is a vital tool to have today. I personally use Surfshark all the time in all sorts of ways I would have never previously anticipated. So if you do not yet have a VPN app, what are you waiting for? Do not delay. Give Surfshark a try today. And don't forget to use the promo code JJMCC. So for Germany, it is tempting to say Christmas, because a lot of American Christmas traditions are German in origin, although they are really more accurately described as Anglo-German, since customs like Christmas trees and wreaths mostly came to America in the form they were being used in Victorian England, as part of a distinctly British movement of nostalgia for England's own Germanic roots. So instead of that, I want to say that Germany's most notable impact on American culture is education. Victorian-era Germany, which is to say Prussia, was regarded by many elite Americans of the time as a paragon of Western civilization, a country that had brilliantly fashioned all of their social institutions according to the leading scientific theories of the late 19th century. And one of the very enlightened theories that they had was this idea of separating school children into precisely defined grades based on age, with special teachers dedicated to only teaching students from that grade, with special separate classrooms for each individual grade and teacher. This was a system that American school reformers explicitly exported from Germany during the late 1800s, and is of course now an almost unquestionable foundational principle of American public schools. Probably the most visibly Germanic legacy of all of this is the fact that we still call the entry point into the standard American K-12 grade system kindergarten. Indian Americans are one of the fastest growing demographics in America, and it feels like their cultural influence, even though already quite large, has yet to fully peak. I feel like we could say one of their biggest influences to date is introducing the Hindu faith to America, which is now generally understood to be in the big top 5 religions of this continent, alongside Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. But instead, I want to go with the multi-billion-dollar American industry of yoga. Yoga is kind of a broad term describing various traditional Hindu practices of meditation and body control. In that sense, there's been some form of yoga in America as long as Indian immigrants have been here, which is to say, centuries. But the sort of yoga that's so popular with white middle-class American women today only really took off in the 1980s or so, when fitness became a distinct concept in American culture. I think everybody knows on some level that this type of yoga doesn't bear that much resemblance to ancient Hindu yoga. It's become heavily Americanized or whitewashed or culturally appropriated or whatever you want to call it. But it is undeniably something that would not exist in America at all if not for India. Indonesia is one of the largest countries in the world, but because it has historically been a rather poor place and located in a pretty inconvenient corner of the globe, its influence on American culture has probably been a lot less than you might expect from a country of its size. Not that many Indonesian people have historically come to this continent, and I feel like awareness of Indonesian stuff over here is generally quite low. But there is one part of Indonesia that is very famous, and that is the island of Java. Historically, a major producer of coffee beans that were exported to America. So major, in fact, that a cup of Java became American slang for coffee sometime in the 19th century, as it remains today. In recent years, this influence has continued in a novel way in the form of the Java and JavaScript computer programming languages, which were named by their American inventors after coffee for some reason. Italy is, of course, one of the great cultural powerhouses of the world, particularly in the post-World War II era, when the country experienced an economic boom and became a major exporter of high-end luxury goods. On that note, I would probably have to nominate Italian luxury fashion brands as that country's most visible cultural presence in America today. Gucci, Prada, DG, Armani, Versace. All of these names are now pretty much synonymous with wealth and glamour in modern America, and a pretty dramatic 180 from the sort of cultural impact Italy has historically had over here. Particularly in the realm of food, Italian influences have tended to come from peasant culture, with immigrants making cheap meals that everyone could afford. But now the Italians just stay in Italy and make things that no one can afford. Good old Japan, everyone's favorite. I don't think this one's that ambiguous. It's obviously video games. From the earliest days of video arcades in the late 1970s to whatever this is in the 2020s, Japanese games and systems have always played a dominant role in shaping American video game culture, a culture which is now the single largest entertainment industry on this continent, as we learned in another award-winning video of mine. Nigeria is the biggest country in Africa and also the largest source of African immigrants to America. And because of that, I think that a lot of our collective understanding of what African culture is like in this part of the world tends to be heavily biased towards Nigerian things. On that note, I would say it is probably Nigerian fashion that has made the biggest impact on modern American culture, particularly Black American culture. Traditional Nigerian clothing is made of very colorful pattern cloth known as Ankara, and a lot of their traditional outfits for both men and women alike entail loose and billowy robes and gowns. Nigerian women also wear a sort of cloth head wrap thing called a gele, and are known for their fancy jewelry. In recent decades, these sorts of looks have become increasingly popular with some Black women in America, particularly since the 1960s, when there became a conscious interest in creating an African-American identity that was more deliberately African in its aesthetics. Jamaica, like Brazil and Argentina, has had a big musical impact on America through reggae, but it must also be conceded that they have had an equally, if not larger, influence on America by way of pot culture. Hemp has been growing in Jamaica for over 100 years, and smoking marijuana became a distinctive part of lower-class Jamaican culture, most famously through the Rastafarian religious movement.
We use ganja not to get high, but so that we can be in communion with one another, and also that we can be in communion with the Creator and be in communion with the environment.
American fascination with this aspect of Jamaica started to become a big thing in the 60s and 70s as more and more young Americans started to develop a more liberal attitude towards pot. The Jamaicans were stereotyped as having a more enlightened, liberated attitude towards it, and as a result, early American pot culture enviously embraced a lot of Jamaican symbols, including reggae, to signal a shared agenda. Today, of course, pot is legal in much of America, and the culture around it is becoming ever more commercial and bourgeois. But even now, Jamaican influences still permeate a lot of it, just because a lot of Americans still like to think of pot as something that will make them as chill and cool as they imagine the Jamaicans to be. Russia is another country that has historically supplied a lot of immigrants to America, and I feel like American Jewish culture in particular often has a lot of visible Russian influence. But I would say that much like the Austrians, the biggest Russian influence on modern America is political and ideological in the form of a Russian-style communism. Communism, as we all know, was invented by a German, Karl Marx. But as a philosophy, it might have faded into obscurity if the Russians hadn't decided to reorganize their entire country around it in the early 20th century. Russia's geopolitical strength as a communist dictatorship, in turn, helped provoke the Cold War, in which Americans understood themselves to be fighting against the spread of communism, with communism understood to be the tyrannical style of communism that the Russians practiced. Unlike some other parts of the world, there was never much actual voter appetite for Russian-style communism in the US or Canada, but distaste for it did leave a cultural impact in its own way, with the iconography used by Russian communists still widely used in modern America as symbols of tyranny, or in some cases, symbols of liberation from the American system, especially these days. Maybe this is a bit of a cop-out, but for the Saudis, I just want to say oil. Obviously, Saudi Arabia didn't invent the idea of using oil to power things, but their enormous oil reserves and their close trade relationship with us, I feel, is broadly understood to have played a key role in making our society as oil-dependent as it is. As fear of radical Islam has risen, Saudi oil has also helped establish a cultural trope of guilt and anxiety, of being too reliant on Middle Eastern oil, and the moral dimensions of having to go to war to protect our access to that oil. But luckily, North America is increasingly energy independent these days, so perhaps in the long term, Saudi Arabia's main cultural legacy over here will just be our conscious decision to not be influenced by them. By now, I'm sure you've heard the story of the role South Africa's De Beers Corporation played in creating the cultural trope of the diamond ring. Basically, back in the late 19th century, a lot of diamonds were discovered in South Africa, and the De Beers marketing department went into overdrive trying to sell them. And they did this largely by inventing a brand new social custom that buying a diamond ring for a lady was this very impressive gesture of love. It's a case study they teach you in every Communications 101 class in college. But however dubious the origins, the marketing campaign worked and a new tradition was established, particularly in America, where Hollywood celebrities really went for it big time. When I was a kid, I remember you could buy these candies that looked like big novelty diamond rings. Ring pops, they called them. I don't know why I brought that up. I guess it's just a fun example of how thoroughly this South African tradition has penetrated our culture. When kids are eating a candy version of it, you've won. Back in 2021, I did a video talking in part about the enormous cultural influence that South Korea has started to exert in America recently, through things like K-pop and Korean TV. But that said, for their biggest cultural influence in America, I'm still gonna have to go with Samsung, South Korea's biggest multinational corporation. As much as we may all love Jungkook, I'm pretty confident that the amount of Americans using a Samsung phone or watching a Samsung TV still greatly eclipses the size of the American brigade of the BTS army. For Sweden, I'm sorry, but it's got to be IKEA. The Swedish company opened its first store on this continent in the late 1970s, and today there are more than 60 locations across the US and Canada. It is easily the most famous furniture company in America, but at the same time, owning too much IKEA stuff has also become synonymous with a certain kind of cheapness and conformity. I will leave it to the Swedes to decide if they are comfortable with that reputation. And lastly, we got Turkey. I feel like it's gotta be Turkish rugs, right? To a lot of people over here, this remains very much the platonic ideal of what a high-quality rug is supposed to look like, given that the Turks have been famous for making and selling luxury rugs to Westerners for centuries. But that said, so have the Persians, and to an ignorant whitey like me, the differences aren't always that obvious. So fine, let's just say that Turkey and Iran can share this one. So there you have it, 20 countries and the 20 cultural marks they have left on America. Obviously, we have barely begun to scratch the surface of this vast topic. So, in the comments below, I want you to make some lists of your own, posting the sorts of things that you think the countries I haven't mentioned have permanently added to American culture. Or if you want to second guess something that I chose, that's fine too. It's not like I have an ego or anything. Anyway, Happy New Year, everyone, and I will see you next week.